Which you prefer, here or there? Thank you. Thank you. Buonasera.
Good afternoon and welcome to this meeting. It is the last day of our festival and we meet Michael Sandel. A few minutes ago, Mr. Sandel showed to me a video that you can find on YouTube of a meeting that he had in Yongsan, which I hope I did not mispronounce, and it is a South Korean city. And the audience included 14,000 people. He told me that there was a system of screens to interact with these 14,000 people, so people would interact and discuss and so on and so forth using the screens. Tonight, or this afternoon, is going to be a bit easier because we are not quite as many, and yet we want to have interaction today as well here in Trento. And we will talk about what money can't buy. I think that the roving mics will be used to take the floor from the audience and talk about this thing. What I said as a sort of introduction is not to shed light on the immense popularity of a philosopher, as is the case with Professor Sandel, but I also share it with you because there is something which I consider to be very important for a publisher. Because you see, the entire intellectual activity of Sandel focuses on the quality of public debate, starting from education, learning, teaching. At Harvard, his lectures are followed and attended in a theater accommodating more than 1,000 students. And if you see and watch on YouTube his course, you will see that it is a very interactive approach. It is a way of discussing by means of examples. And if you read your book, his book, on justice, as this one published by Feltrinelli, his teaching, I was saying, is based on some features which entail the fact of providing practical and also imaginary examples. And that is the first thing. And then the second quality and characteristic is the capability of providing a number of arguments and argue on both sides, so to say, and also convey the opinions of those who think differently. He has a community-based approach in terms of commonality. And in this book, Sandel, but in general, of course, conveys the best of the approaches that are based on freedom and on a libertarian attitude. Against Perfection, the first book published in Italian by Sandel, focused on genetic engineering as well, being the possibility of deciding the characteristics of our children. And Sandel argues against this type of engineering. Genetic engineering is important for health purposes, for instance, to prevent or control serious problems. But when you want to have blue eyes or blonde hair or a braver child, then that is wrong. And he argues on that side, but also conveys the opinions of others that are in favor of genetic engineering. So giving the possibility of hearing others' opinions, I believe, is not only a good philosophy, but also a good ingredient in democracy. democracy itself. That should be common in common discourse. And this is the reason why we thought it very important to have an intellectual such as Michael Sandel taking the floor here at the festival. And in his book that has been published by Feltrinelli, he conveys a number of very interesting thoughts about economy. You know, the festival hosts economists, but not only economists. And we wanted, indeed, to have an open festival, which is a festival which is open to discussion. We wanted to talk about the way by which economy influences our life, hence the presence of Michael Sandel. So I would say that it is the right time now to talk about what money can't buy with Michael Sandel. Thank you.
Aggiungo una cosa importante perché
If I may, I would like to add one thing because I promote Feltrinelli, you see. At the end of our meeting, after your questions, Sandel is available to sign copies of the book, but please at the exit, otherwise it's going to be very complicated. So that's it. My ad is finished.
To begin, thank you very much to Mr. Latarza for that warm and generous introduction. Today I would like to discuss with you, and I do hope we'll have a discussion here, a simple question. At least a question that's simple to state, maybe not so easy to answer. And the question is this: what should be the role of money and markets in our societies? Today, there are very few things that money can't buy. Let me begin by saying to you, Pepe, that if you were ever in Santa Barbara, California, and sentenced to a jail term, if that should ever happen to you,
I hope not.
If you don't like the standard accommodations in the jail, did you know that you can buy a prison cell upgrade to a better cell? For how much money, do you suppose? What would you guess?
I know it because I hear you saying
Oh,
this.
you've already read it.
But they will.
It's about $90 a night. Or suppose you go with your family to a theme park or to an amusement park, like Gardaland. The lines are sometimes long, the queues. Now, in some places, and when I was young, part of the experience of going to an amusement park or a theme park was standing on a long queue for the most popular rides. This was part of the experience. But today, in many amusement parks and theme parks, certainly in the US and in the UK, if you don't like to stand on the long queues, you can pay extra and go to the head of the line. Now, this may not seem like a very serious example. It may seem quite attractive. But you can also buy your way to the head of the line in other places throughout our societies. In Washington, D.C., if you want to sit in on a congressional hearing in person, and it might be a very popular hearing. Suppose you're a lobbyist, and you don't want to wait in a very long queue, maybe for hours and hours, maybe overnight, maybe in the rain. You can go to a company, pay them a certain amount of money. They will hire a homeless person or someone else who needs the work to stand in the line for you until just before the hearing begins. You pay your money and in you go to the front of the line. Now, the name of the company, one of these companies, is linestanding.com. What strikes me is that in amusement parks and in more important places, like congressional hearings, more and more in our societies, it's possible to buy one's way to the head of the line, to the head of the queue. And there are new ways in which money and marketing reach into every sphere of life. Suppose you want to make some extra money, and you can go to an advertising company. There are advertising companies looking for new places to market and advertise products, not only in newspapers and on television and on billboards. Now, some advertising companies sell advertising space on people's bodies, including their foreheads. You can make some extra money, if you need some, by going to an advertising company and selling space on your forehead for a tattoo advertisement. One woman did this who needed money. She was a single mother, needed money to support the education of her son. And do you know how much money she got? $10,000 for a permanent tattoo on her forehead. Unfortunately, the company that paid her was an online casino. And so she has the name of the casino on her forehead. Tattoo ads. Now, this may seem like a small example, but what it illustrates is a bigger development in our societies. Market thinking, market reasoning, increasingly govern more and more aspects of life. And one can see this looking at big institutions. We see now more and more, in many countries, for-profit schools, for-profit hospitals, for-profit prisons. We see also for-profit companies fighting our wars. In Iraq and Afghanistan, there were more private military contractors on the ground in those places than there were U.S. military troops. Now, this isn't because we ever had a public debate about whether we wanted to outsource war to private companies, but this is what has happened. And this is what I'd like to speak about here in Trento today. Over the past 3 decades, we've drifted, almost without realizing it, from having a market economy to becoming market societies. The difference is this: a market economy is a tool, a valuable and effective tool for organizing productive activity. But a market society is a place where everything is up for sale. It's a way of life in which market values and market reasoning and market thinking reach into almost every sphere of life: family life, personal relations, health, education, politics, the media, civic life. Today, there is almost nothing that money can't buy. There are still a few things. What are the good things in life that money still can't buy? Friendship is one. If you don't have enough friends and would like a few more, and find it difficult, perhaps, to make friends in the usual way, it might occur to you to try to buy some friends. But then it would quickly occur to you that this wouldn't work. It's an interesting philosophical question why it wouldn't work. Why can't money buy friends? Somehow, the money that would buy the good dissolves the good that you're aiming at. We all sense that a bought friend is not the same as a real one. But with most goods, this isn't true. With most goods, money does not necessarily dissolve or destroy the good itself. Consider kidneys or organs for transplantation. There are some economists who say that using standard economic logic, it would make sense to have a free market in the purchase and sale of kidneys for transplantation. There is today an imbalance between the supply and the demand for kidneys. People desperately need them. Why not use a market? Some economists argue. Now, you may agree or disagree with the idea of a free market in organs, human organs, for transplantation. But with a kidney is unlike friendship in this respect. If you were in need of a kidney and bought one from someone willing to sell, the kidney would still work. The money would not dissolve the goods you're aiming at. The kidney would work, assuming a good match, regardless of the market exchange. So kidneys are different from friendship in this respect. Money can buy a kidney. The question is whether it should. And this is exactly the kind of question that I think we in democratic societies need to debate today. Where do markets belong? And where may they do damage to social life or to social practices or to the goods worth aiming at? Now, with most goods, it may be unclear, with many goods, it may be unclear whether money would dissolve the good being aimed at. Take not friendship, but an expression of friendship. When you go to a wedding, there are wedding speeches or wedding toasts, often by the best friend of the groom. Now, these speeches are usually, sometimes they're funny, deeply personal, sometimes they're sentimental, heartwarming. But some people are a little bit anxious when they're asked to give a toast to their best friend at a wedding or a speech. And today there is help for such people. There are websites that will sell wedding speeches, personalized wedding speeches. One of these websites is called theperfecttoast.com. You go online, you enter some information about your friend, about the couple about to be married, about how they came to know one another. You can tell them whether you want a funny speech or a sentimental one. And within 3 business days, they will send you a custom-written wedding speech. For how much do you suppose? $149, including shipping and handling. Now, it would seem then that money can buy a personalized, heartwarming wedding speech. Or can it? Is it the same good? Now suppose, here's a way to think about it. Suppose that at your wedding, your best friend gave a warm, sentimental, funny, heartwarming speech that brought tears to your eyes. And then later you learned that he had bought that speech online. How would you feel? Would it be worth less? Probably it would. So what this suggests is that although money can buy the wedding speech, it changes the good. It changes the thing that we seek. It degrades or corrupts or degrades or erodes the value and meaning. Now, this points to a larger question, which is, when do market mechanisms, the use of money, cash incentives, when do they actually degrade or corrupt or diminish the value of the good or the social practice at stake? Economists often assume that markets are inert, that they are neutral, that markets do not touch or taint or change the goods being exchanged. And for material goods, this is often true. If you sell me a flat-screen television, or if you give me one as a gift, the television will work just as well either way. The good will not be changed by the fact that I've bought it from you. But with non-market goods, this may not be true. When we're talking about family relations, personal relations, social and civic life, introducing a market mechanism may change and may diminish the meaning of the social practice. And yet, it's not always obvious when this is so. So I would like to put to you a question to do with teaching and learning and the role of cash incentives. And I'd be interested to hear what you think about it. Now, in many schools, teachers struggle to motivate the students to learn, to work hard, to score well on tests. In a number of large American cities, with the help of some economists, they are experimenting with a new way of motivating children and students to study, paying cash incentives for good grades or for high test scores. $50 for an A, $35 for a B. They've tried this in New York, in Chicago, in Washington, D.C. In Dallas, Texas, they offer 8-year-olds $2 for each book they read. The goal is admirable, to motivate students, especially students from struggling families, disadvantaged backgrounds, to motivate students to study, to read. But some people object, and I would like to put this question to you for discussion. Let's take a vote. We'll take a survey here by a show of hands. If you were the head of a school, you were in charge of one of these schools, and you were trying to find a way to motivate students to improve, to work harder, how many would favor this proposal, and how many would oppose it? Let's see first. Raise your hand, those of you here who think it might be worth a try, paying cash incentives for improved grades or test scores or to read books. How many would be in favor? Raise your hands. Those of you in favor. And not too many. How many would be opposed? How many would reject this idea? There are some people who didn't vote. The majority seem to be opposed. Let's have a discussion. Let's begin, and we have people with microphones throughout the room. Let's begin by hearing from someone who opposes this practice, who thinks it's wrong to pay students for academic improvement or achievement. What would be your reason? Yes, in the back. Stand up and tell us tell us your name.
Hi, my name is Josephine. I think you take the pleasure out of reading if you pay people to do it.
You take the pleasure out of reading.
Yes, I think if you want people to do something, you have to make them enjoy it.
Right?
And I think if you pay somebody to do it, they might think of, afterwards I can go to the cinema or whatever, and they are not really enjoying the moment of reading. And I think that is important.
But Josephine, maybe they would say, I enjoy making the money.
Yes, but the goal here is to read.
The goal is to read.
Yes, and you can make money in other ways.
Well, but what about the idea of reading and making money?
You're right. But still, I think that what you need to do is maybe it needs to be an enjoyment.
So,
and I think if it becomes an enjoyment, people will do it without having to be paid. You have to do something, you have to be able to do some things without have to be paid every time. Otherwise, I can pay you for whatever.
Right. I understand. That's good. All right, Josephine, thank you for that.
Thank you.
Here, wait, all right, now let's see if there's someone who disagrees with Josephine. Josephine worries that if you pay students to read, they won't learn to love reading, they'll just do it for the money. And Josephine wants these students to learn to love reading. Do I have it right? All right. So that's a strong objection. Now let's hear from someone who thinks it would be worth trying this experiment. And let's see if you can reply to Josephine's argument against. And I want to say you can answer the question in Italian as well as English, because thanks to this machine, I understand Italian. So please feel free to speak in either language. And who thinks this plan would be worth a try and has a reply to Josephine's argument? Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Luca.
Luca.
Yes. As for the reading part being necessary to be enjoyed, I don't agree. I think the main purpose of the program would be to improve test scores and not necessarily to have people read more Jane Austen novels. And in any case,
you don't think it's worth much to pay people to read a Jane Austen novel?
Yes, I wouldn't pay anyone. Maybe if somebody's reading a calculus book or physics or something that is going to improve test scores.
You would pay them to read a calculus book, but not
Yes.
Jane Austen.
It depends. I mean, the marginal value is different.
The marginal value is different. Are you an economist by any chance?
I like to think so.
Yeah? Yes. How did I guess? Well, but wait, let me just ask then one follow-up. If the marginal value of reading a calculus book is higher than reading Jane Austen, why not offer different financial rewards?
Yes, we could have different schemes. Yes, coming to my next point, I think it also depends on the size of the offer. Obviously, if I offer $1, it's not that much, it's just an incentive. So maybe I can think of if I'm doing it, reading the calculus book, and I get $1 for it, I can say I do it for an ulterior reason, for myself and for $1. Maybe I can go to the cinema. I would do it anyways, but I do it with an ulterior motive. Obviously, if it becomes more of, if I want to earn a lot of money, then the motive becomes to read for the money, not actually to understand calculus, if we stay with calculus.
Oh, but then that comes close to Josephine's point, doesn't it?
Yes, it comes close, but it depends on the size. I mean, it needs to be balanced.
Depends on how much is being offered. So if we're just talking about $2, no one, you think, would read a calculus book just for $2.
Yeah, it needs to be balanced, I don't know.
All right. Thank you for that. Who else would like to add to this discussion and say why he or she would favor this idea? I think it might be worth trying. Yes.
Yeah, there's also Rob Johnson.
Okay. All right. Let's hear first here. Go ahead, and then we'll come.
Well, I think you should teach a student that if he study something, if you read something, then you will achieve something in the future. So the reward you will get will be just postponed.
And so you would pay them?
No, not
you
even.
Wouldn't.
I would teach them that they would get a reward in the future, so they have to do that if they want to achieve their goals in the future.
And what would the future reward be, would you tell them?
Well, it depends according to each one. For someone would be to do something they like, for some other one would be to have a lot of money. So they will read and study what they think is more useful for them to reach their goals.
But suppose if for the 8-year-old, suppose that doesn't work.
Well, yeah, that's the teaching part, like parents and teachers, they should convey this idea to them.
Okay, what do you say?
I would offer that there is a benefit to society above and beyond what happens to any individual from reading and the growth of imagination. So you would strengthen the democracy and you would strengthen the society by having all of us read more, and it is worth subsidizing for that reason.
So you would pay them?
Yes.
And how do you answer Josephine's worry that by paying them, you might cultivate bad habits, you might teach the wrong lesson, you might teach them that reading is a chore to be done for pay? How would you reply to that argument?
I would reply that sometimes you have to do something in order to experience the joy of it, and an incentive, like a threshold that induces you in that direction, might engender a love you otherwise would have missed.
So it could be that the student who reads for the $2 falls in love with reading.
And doesn't need to be paid in subsequent
and then you don't have to pay them anymore. And then all is well. And then you've not crowded out the intrinsic love of reading. You've kindled it. You've inspired it. You've kick-started it with the money. And then the money can stop. What about that, Josephine? What do you say to that? That the money could get the young people reading, and then they will fall in love with reading, and then you won't have to pay them anymore.
I think it's difficult because you start in a certain mindset. Because I start reading because I get paid. And so you do not really read, I think, for enjoyment.
You read for the wrong reason.
Yes. And if you're in that mindset, I think it's difficult to change. I'm a teacher.
Oh, you're a teacher. Okay.
Yes.
And how old are the students you teach?
No, they're at university.
Okay, university, yes.
Yes. And I think maybe now all my students are thinking, is she really saying this? But I think you need people to enjoy. So you need to have some enthusiasm so that they will go out and have the enthusiasm to find out stuff by themselves. Because I only have a certain amount of time to teach them stuff, and I cannot do that. So what I try to convey is also give them some enthusiasm, give them some joy to go out and look for it for themselves.
The love of learning for its own sake.
Yeah, and also I teach languages. So I tell them at a certain point when you learn the languages, you discover a whole world. Right. And it's out there for you to discover and to enjoy.
So you try to point to the intrinsic importance and love that you're trying to nurture among the students.
I think you learn best when you enjoy it.
Okay, I've got it. That's very powerful. All right, I want to thank everyone who's participated in this round of the discussion. Really good comments on both sides. Now, I should say about what's happened with these experiments so far. Paying for good grades or high test scores doesn't seem to have worked in most places. Paying the kids to read books, the $2 for each book, did lead those students to read more books. It also led them to read shorter books. But the real question is the one that has been... But the real question is the one we've just been debating, which is, what will happen to these kids in the long run? What will happen when the money stops? Now, on one view, what may happen is the incentive scheme may expose the students to reading. They may fall in love with reading for its own sake, in which case when the money stops, they will continue reading books and learning and loving reading. Or it could turn out the other way. It could be, as Josephine worries, that the monetary payment will teach the wrong lesson and that lesson is what will last and stay. And if that's what happens, then these students may find it difficult to learn or to acquire the intrinsic love of reading and learning. What this example suggests is that it may be unclear in any given case whether the use of a cash incentive or a market mechanism will support or corrupt the intrinsic good of an activity, in this case, learning to love reading for its own sake. But that in order to decide whether to use a market mechanism, we have to ask not only about economic efficiency, and we have to ask not only how many more books do those kids read in a given year. We have to ask, what is the good that we are aiming at? What is the larger purpose? The larger purpose, after all, is not to maximize the number of books read in that year. The larger purpose, in this case, of education, is to cultivate a lifetime love of learning and reading. And that's a normative question. That's an attitude toward reading. That's a norm. That's a value. And so we have to ask whether the market mechanism will support that value or whether it will corrupt it or degrade it or erode it or crowd it out. Some years ago in Switzerland, they were trying to decide where to locate a nuclear waste site. No community wants one in its backyard. They identified a small town in the mountains of Switzerland as likely to be the safest place. But under the law, the community had to approve. And so before the decision was made, a survey was done of the residents of this small Swiss town. And they were asked, if the parliament chooses your town for the nuclear waste site, will you vote to approve it? 51% said yes. Then they asked a second question. They improved the offer. They said, suppose Parliament chooses your town for the nuclear waste site and offers to pay in compensation each resident of the town a yearly amount of money, up to 6,000 euros. Then would you be willing to accept? Now how many people were willing to approve, do you think? What would you say? 100%.
60%.
60%. What do you think? 80%. Less than before. The number willing to approve when the money was offered fell in half, from 51 to 25%. It fell in half. Now, from the standpoint of standard economic reasoning, this is a puzzle, this is a paradox. Because the standard price effect in every economics textbook teaches that if you offer people money to do something, more of them will be willing to do that thing, not fewer. So what happened in the Swiss town? Who has an explanation? What do you think? Here, stand up and we'll... And
maybe because before they were doing it for the public good, and then they understood it was more for the money, and the money wasn't worth suddenly. So the public good was better than the money in this case, I think.
Okay. So then what's your name?
Nicola.
Nicole says, that before they were doing it for the public good, out of a sense of civic responsibility. But when the money was offered, it became a different kind of choice, a different kind of transaction. It became a matter of a financial transaction. And that does seem to be the reason that the number fell in half when the money was offered. They asked the people, why did you change your mind when the money was offered? Many of them said, we didn't want to be bribed. But why was the money understood as a bribe? Well, a bribe suggests a corrupt monetary offer. That's what we mean by a bribe, isn't it? Something that corrupts. But what was corrupted here exactly? What was corrupting? Well, as Nicole suggested, a sense of civic responsibility among those who were willing to make the sacrifice without the payment. But when they were offered money, they felt, here I'm being asked to accept money to expose myself and my family to grave risk. And I'm not willing, many of them felt, to sell out. That's what it felt like, selling out the safety of my family for the sake of money. So what had been a civic question, a question of the public good, was changed by the introduction of the monetary offer into a financial transaction. And so here was an example where the introduction of a market mechanism or a cash incentive did not leave things just as they were. The money crowded out or corrupted the higher motivation, the sense of civic responsibility. In Israel, there was a kindergarten, a daycare center, that experienced a familiar problem. Parents coming late to pick up their children. And so, also with the help of some economists, the daycare center, the kindergarten, established a fine for late arriving parents. What do you suppose happened? Say it again.
Well, I think that everybody would come on time, as is the case with the regional council in Trento. If we have to pay the fine, we all arrive on time.
How much is the fine? But how much is the fine in Trento? €50 That's more. Well, what happened in the kindergarten, in the daycare center, when they established a fine, the opposite happened. More parents came late. More parents came late. Now, why? Why do you think more parents came late? Again, from the standpoint of standard economic analysis, if you put a price on something, or if you increase the price, fewer people will do that thing or consume that good. But here, more people came late. More parents came late and paid the fine. Why do you suppose that happened? Yes, in the orange. In the orange, yes. Stand up.
Hi, my name is Clemens Huber. I think maybe they thought that their freedom was at stake. So they were the ones wanted to fight for their freedom to come late.
To fight for their freedom to come late?
Yes.
They could have fought for their freedom to come late when it was free.
But before the freedom wasn't at stake.
Oh, before their freedom wasn't at stake. But they did, but how free were they? They came late and they paid the money. They paid the money.
Maybe the fine wasn't high enough.
It's possible. So if the fine, how high would the fine have to be in order to reduce the late arrivals?
It depends. In Switzerland, rather high. In Israel too, but maybe in a poor state.
All right.
Yeah.
So if it were $1 million for a late arrival, probably that would have been more coming on time, like with the Trento Council. But it's still, that may be true. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
That may be true. And still there is something here to explain. And what seems to be the case is as something similar to what happened in the Swiss town. The parents, before when they came late, when there was no fine, parents felt guilty for coming late. They were imposing on the teachers who had to stay with their children until they arrived. But once there was a fine, once there was a monetary payment, they treated the fine as if it were a fee for a late arrival. And they felt they were paying a babysitting fee, something like that. And so the guilt, the sense of obligation to arrive on time, went away. Now they were just paying for a service. So the financial payment changed the meaning of the late arrival and increased late arrivals. When the kindergarten saw the effect of the fine, they removed it. But do you know what happened? The new pattern of increased late arrivals continued, which suggests something of quite far-reaching consequence. It suggests that once markets and cash incentives and market mechanisms erode or crowd out non-market attitudes and values, in this case, the sense of responsibility to show up on time, it's not easy to reverse. Because attitudes, values, norms, these can be corrupted or eroded or diminished by market relations. But they can't easily and quickly be turned back on as if it were a light switch. Because often non-market values and norms and attitudes require time and shared understandings to cultivate and to build up. Now, what these examples suggest, I think there are two implications for the discussions we've had about teaching and learning, about the nuclear waste site, about the parents showing up late to pick up their children. What these examples show is that contrary to mainstream economic analysis, markets do not leave the world unchanged. Sometimes, introducing a market mechanism or a cash incentive may crowd out non-market values and attitudes worth caring about. And if that's true, then in order to decide when to use markets and where to use markets, it's not enough simply to ask about economic efficiency. It's also necessary to ask whether the market mechanism will disturb or corrupt or drive out non-market attitudes, values, and norms worth caring about. And if they do, is the gain in efficiency worth the loss in the attitudes and values? If that's the question we have to ask in order to decide where markets serve the public good and where they don't belong, then economics, as a discipline, as a science, needs to change. Because in recent decades, really going back to the early 20th century, economics has presented itself as a value-neutral science of human behavior. And many textbooks still teach economics in this way. But what these examples and our discussion suggest is that economics is not a value-neutral science. that economics unavoidably rests on certain claims about values and about moral and political philosophy that economists, many economists, not all, ignore when calculating economic efficiency. So if this is right, one implication is that we need to challenge two assumptions of mainstream economics. The assumption that markets are value neutral, and also a second assumption. Many economists might listen to the discussion we've had and to the conclusions I've drawn from it and offer the following objection. Yes, it's true, they might say. Economics rests on assumptions of self-interest. But that's a good thing because generosity, altruism, civic virtue are rare commodities that we need to conserve. And so it's better that we rely on self-interest when we can. One of the most famous examples of markets driving out non-market values involves blood, human blood. In the 1970s, a sociologist, a British sociologist, Richard Titmuss, wrote a book comparing the system of blood donation in the US and in the UK. In the UK, there was no market in blood, only donated blood. In the US, you could donate blood or you could buy and sell it. Titmuss showed that contrary to arguments and expectations about economic efficiency, the system with no market in blood actually worked better in economic terms, produced a better supply, a more reliable supply, a healthier supply of blood than one that included a market in blood. But he also made another point, which is allowing a market in blood, though it doesn't require anyone who wants to donate blood to sell, nonetheless, a market in blood, he found, or he argued, crowds out the altruistic impulse to donate blood. Titmuss's book about blood was reviewed by one of the most famous economists of his generation, Kenneth Arrow. And Arrow said he thought this was a puzzling conclusion. One of the arguments Arrow made was we should rely on self-interest, the market, to allocate blood as a way of conserving the scarce resource of altruism and generosity so that we would have it when we really need it. Here's what Arrow wrote. I do not want, like many economists, I do not want to rely too heavily on substituting ethics for self-interest. I think it is best, on the whole, that the requirement of ethical behavior be confined to those circumstances where the price system breaks down. We do not wish to use up recklessly the scarce resources of altruistic motivation. This was Arrow. So the idea, and this is an idea, this is not an official principle that you find in the textbooks. It's not like the law of supply and demand, but this assumption that virtue needs to be economized, that it exists in fixed supply. This assumption runs very deep among many economists, and it fuels the faith in markets. We can't rely too much, this argument says, on civic virtue and generosity and altruism and benevolence because we will use them up. We will spend them down as if they were like fossil fuels in fixed supply. I think this metaphor is misleading. Altruism, generosity, solidarity, civic virtue, these are not like commodities that are depleted with use. They are more like muscles that are strengthened with exercise. And that makes a difference for our public life and for democratic life. I think one of the defects, one of the weaknesses of the market-driven societies we inhabit is that there are fewer and fewer occasions to exercise these civic virtues, these generous virtues, and that the result is not to conserve them so that they are available intact for moments when we really need them. The effect has been the opposite. The effect has been to get us out of the habit of asking more of one another as fellow citizens. That is one of the corrosive effects of societies increasingly driven by market values and market thinking and market reasoning. There's one other habit that we've lost in an age of market faith. Against a background of rising inequality, putting a price on everything leads to a growing separation between the affluent and those of modest means. There are fewer and fewer occasions when rich and poor come together in the common spaces of democratic life. In so many of our societies now, after 3 decades of market triumphalism, we find that the affluent and those of modest means live and work and shop and play in different places. We send our children to different schools. This isn't good for democracy, nor is it a satisfying way to live, even for those of us who can afford to buy our way to the head of the queue. And the reason is this: democracy does not require perfect equality, but it does require that men and women from different backgrounds encounter one another, bump up against one another in the course of their everyday lives. Because this is how we learn to negotiate our differences. And this is how we come to care for the common good. And so in the end, the question of markets is not only, it's not even mainly an economic question. It's really a question of how we want to live together. Do we want a society where everything is up for sale? Or are there certain moral and civic goods that markets do not honor and money cannot buy? Thank you very much.
Shall we have 2 or 3 questions? It's up to you. Whatever you think. Quarter of an hour.
Bene, io penso che...
Well, I think that irrespective of what you think, the way of putting forward arguments by Sandel has been very interesting and stimulating for us all, irrespective of what we think. And this is, again, the approach that we want to have at the Festival of Economics. Sandel arrived today, but I told him that over the past days we had different clashing opinions as well about the very same topics, which were seen from different standpoints. I would say that we have 10-15 minutes at our disposal, if you want. So I would say that if you have questions, if you want to put forward different opinions, and typically if there are economists, we also accept questions from them, and not only from economists, of course. But if you have questions, if you have doubts, if you think that something that was said was too partial, please, this is the right moment to make a comment. Please state your name. Good evening. Felice Zambagli. Felice is the name. I really appreciated what you told us, but perhaps you also, well, you should have mentioned voluntary work as well, and the culture of voluntary work. I'm quite aged, and I spent my entire life with voluntary work and blood donation as well. 16 years at the Red Cross and the Italian Association for Organ Donation. So I would really invite all young people to do voluntary work, because that makes us better people. They will mature more, and that will also bring the different generations closer to continue life together. Thank you.
I agree.
Qualche altra?
Other questions, comments?
Thanks a lot for the interesting. Oh, it's here. Thanks a lot for interesting speech. It's a provocative question. There's a paper of Ellickson, 2000. I think you know it. It's the market for social norms. So basically the idea is it's possible through market mechanism to achieve social norms creation, effective or efficient or even good, if you want, in a value stuff, through market mechanism. So I would say that, well, it's true market could frame badly some situation, but it's not necessarily a dichotomy between markets and good norms.
Well, thank you for the question. I think it is sometimes possible that market mechanisms or cash incentives could encourage rather than corrupt social norms or civic norms or moral norms, non-market norms. In fact, the debate we had about paying to read reflects this. One suggestion was that the cash incentive could get the child to begin reading, but having begun, the child would develop and learn the love of reading, and a social norm or an intrinsic valuation of reading might be the result. And if that were the effect of this system in the school, there would be a very strong case for it. All I'm suggesting is that it can work both ways, and typically, it works in the opposite direction from this hopeful scenario. Typically, it works in the opposite direction, where introducing a market mechanism or a cash incentive may undermine or crowd out the social norm or the civic norm, as in the Swiss nuclear waste case, where the money crowded out or drove out the civic motivation, the willingness to sacrifice. So all I'm really suggesting, though, is that it can work both ways, and we have to take account of that effect, of the effect of markets on norms, and to evaluate, even if we can determine what that effect is likely to be in a given case, we have also to assess the effect on norms. And that's a question of values. It's not a value-neutral question. What norms do we want to encourage with regard to teaching and learning, or with regard to shared civic sacrifice, with regard to military service, with regard to criminal punishment, with regard to family life? What norms should we want to protect? That's a question of values. And yet, much economic analysis forgets that there can be an effect on norms, for better or for worse, often for worse. And if that's the case, then economics can't really think of itself or present itself as a value-neutral science. That's my main argument.
I just said that there are at least 30 years of crowding out theory in, well, it's not mainstream economics, but there are at least 30 years of crowding out theories of economists that study this stuff. So it's just, I stand for the profession.
Well, the crowding out theory that has been developed, as you say, rightly.
American Economic Review, econometrica papers, so, the top journals already recognize this stuff.
I think that's all to the good, and I don't deny it for a moment. But what I am suggesting is that given the crowding out effect, which, as you say, is increasingly recognized by, if not mainstream economists, by many economists who are doing important work and writing in journals, the crowding out effect has more far-reaching results than the crowding out economists or the behavioral economists have worked out and articulated. And because it's one thing to say this may confound the prediction about the effect of a cash incentive. And that point has been made by the crowding out literature. I agree. But it's a further question about how we should evaluate this norm being crowded out or that. And that's a question of moral and political philosophy. That's my point. And therefore, once one accepts the crowding out effect, which I agree has been written about, there's a further, more far-reaching, I would say maybe even radical implication, which is that that the economist, qua economist, should be involved in evaluating the norms that are crowded in or crowded out. And that evaluative project requires that economics reconnect with moral and political philosophy, as it was when economics was invented back in the days of Adam Smith. There was one subject. Economics was understood as a branch of moral and political philosophy, not as an autonomous discipline. And I think that's what we need to go back to. I think that's what the crowding out literature points us to reintegrating economics into a broader field of moral and political economy, or as it would be described these days, moral and political philosophy. And many economists, I think, would hesitate to be subsumed under that broader rubric. That's all.
Abbiamo tempo forse per un'ultima domanda.
We have some time for the very last question. In the microphone, please. In the microphone, please. In the microphone, please. My name is Maurizio, and I'm a sociologist.
Theater.
Aspetti che si può togliere la cuffia. Okay. Speaking in English. So.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yesterday in this theater, Stefano Rodotà agreed with you on the extension of market mechanism and we can say the commodification of life in an extensive way in contemporary society. And as a person with a background in law and so on, Stefano Rodotà argued that one of the boundaries that we can put to the extension of market mechanism is the recognizance of strong individual rights. So I'm wondering from your perspective, because you have pointed out very well how market thinking is in some way corrupting our way of living or has corrupted our way of living. I was wondering, from the point of view of constructing or reconstructing new ways of living that marginalize the negative effect of market mechanism, if you agree with Rodota that individual rights are the starting point, or if you can find any other argument for that.
I think individual rights are important for their own sake. I don't see them as the primary solution to market-driven societies. They are important for their own sake. The reason I don't see them as a sufficient response to the commodification of social life is that it's perfectly possible to have a political system, a political order, and a constitution that requires and enforces respect for rights, for individual rights, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly and association, privacy rights, human rights. It's perfectly possible to have a system that respects all of those individual rights, and yet still is a society where many social goods and practices are corrupted by being dominated by money and markets. And so what I think we need to do is to go beyond, in order to have a public debate. Here's another way of putting the question. What passes for public discourse these days is pretty impoverished. During the same 3 decades when the market triumphalist faith has predominated, these have also been decades when the public life of most democracies and the public discourse have been hollowed out, emptied of larger meaning and purpose. And I think there's a connection between these two things. Part of the appeal of market reasoning is that it seems to enable us to make social decisions without engaging in explicit public debate about contested ethical questions, including questions of justice and the common good and civic virtue. Markets seem to offer a neutral mechanism that spares us as democratic citizens the need to reason together and argue together about the proper way of valuing goods, whether it's teaching and learning, or procreation and child rearing in the case of paid pregnancy and surrogate motherhood. It seems to spare us all of those hard ethical controversies in public life. So I think what we need, beyond a regime of respect for individual rights, we need a public discourse that engages more directly with contested questions about the common good and about the good life. We shrink from these debates, not only because we're in the grip of market reasoning, but also because we, in pluralist societies, know that people disagree about the good life and about how to value everything from pregnancy to military service to prison cell upgrades. We disagree about those values, and so we shrink from them. But I think that has led to a politics preoccupied with narrow, managerial, technocratic questions, and we've lost the ability as democratic citizens to reason together about big questions that matter, including questions of justice and the common good and civic virtue and how we want to live together. So respect for individual rights is important. It can be a prerequisite for that kind of debate, but it can't be a substitute for that kind of debate. And so I think we need to have a morally more robust kind of public discourse from the kind to which we become accustomed if we're to begin to define the moral limits of markets. Not because we'll agree on every question, but because it will make for a healthier democratic life.
Bene, io vi ringrazio.
I thank you very much for being here. Thank you, Michael Sandel. That was a wonderful end of our meeting, and then we have the next meeting with the Nobel Prize winner Merlis. Earlier on, Professor Sandel said something fundamental, which is that altruism and generosity are not scarce commodities, but as muscles, they increase with exercise. I think that that goes also for public discourse and for the capability of putting forward arguments. This is the core of our democracy. This is something that we try and do with all our limits. At the Festival of Economics, we will continue doing so, also thanks to the enormous success we had in these very days. Thank you so much for participating so much. Thanks to all of you, and thank you to Michael Sandel.
Ci vediamo all'uscita. Michael Sandel verrà vicino alla libreria a firmare le copie per chi vuole.